Thanks for checking out this week's message. No matter where you are, we hope that you'll be inspired and know that you're part of our one family. If you enjoy the ministry of our church, you can help us share messages like this by supporting us financially. Just press the give button at onechurchsc.org. It's quick, easy, and secure. Now let's prepare our hearts for this week's message.
I just want to start off. I want to start off by saying, if you'd asked me years ago if I ever thought, or if anybody in my family probably ever thought, I'd be standing right here, they put you and me both in the loony bin. This is the last thing that I ever thought I would get the opportunity to do. And just before I even get started, I just want God to have all the glory for that. It's nothing I've ever done in my life. It's all Him. I'm glad my family's here today. My mom, my dad, my stepmother, my father and mother-in-law. I just wanted to take a second, when I have this platform, my mother has always been such a supporter of me. She sacrificed her own happiness, I don't know how many times, so that me and my brother and my family would be happy. And I just want to take that opportunity to do that. I don't know if I'll ever have an opportunity like this again, so I just wanted to do that. So I kind of always said, if I ever got this chance, this opportunity, that I would just share my testimony and my story about my life. But when Joe asked, we were sitting in a staff meeting that Wednesday night, and he asked all of us pastors, he said, laid out the schedule and said we'd all kind of take turns preaching, around before Easter and after Easter. Well, my first thought was, oh, crap. Here we go. I knew I would probably be in this situation, but I didn't know if I was prepared or not yet. So I've prayed over the past few weeks, and I've been back and forth. It was several times I almost told Joel, I can't do it. I just can't do it. But God reminded me that I said if I ever had the chance and anyone ever gave me the opportunity to have this platform, that I would. So I just wanted to obey Him. So when my nervousness came down from 100 to about 99.9, the subject of wasting grace came to mind. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to share a little bit of my testimony, a little bit about how we waste God's grace in our lives. First, the verse I want to read today is coming out of the Message. It's a translation of the Bible I really love reading because it's down to earth. It's on my level, and it uses some different words, and it kind of gets the point across in a different way. So you don't have to turn there. It's going to be on the screens, but I wanted to read you this verse to start off this morning. It's 1 Corinthians 15:10, and it says, "But because God was so gracious, so very generous, here I am, and I'm not about to let His grace go to waste." I could set this mic down right now. That's just a strong word right there in itself. Here I am because of Him, and I'm not going to waste His grace. To start off, let's define grace a little bit. The dictionary says it's unmerited divine assistance given to humans for their sanctification. It's unmerited, which means it's free. It's given freely. We can also see grace as mercy or God's love. So in saying that, we could surmise that we owe everything to God and His grace. Everything. Our life, everything we own, everything we owe to Him. So wouldn't you say that wasting something like that, something like as generous and as valuable as grace, would be ridiculous? Why would we ever do that? Well, it's our human nature to sin and in turn ignore some of the things God has done for us. We are born this way. So even as a child, we are shown grace, but don't even realize it. When I was very young, I believe 3 or 4, my biological father left my mom And it's probably my first memory. This is the first thing I can think back to was when my dad packed his clothes in trash bags and left in his truck. And I remember my mom and him asking me, you know, do you want to stay with your mom or do you want to go with your dad? And I picked my mom, and I believe that was God speaking through me. That was his grace. Later, my mom would meet and marry the man that I call my dad today, that I call my father today. And I can't say enough that he is the father that God had planned for me. While I am grateful for the man that gave me life, he wasn't the man who God had prepared to raise me. And years later, when I met my wife, Andrea, I was introduced to another wonderful father, my father-in-law, and more grandfathers and my grandfathers that I already had. And as a team, they would be the godly influence in my life. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both my dads are named Tony. Because when anybody asks, you know, who's your dad, I don't ever have to think which dad you're talking about. I just say Tony, and then I figure out which one they're talking about later. So, God's grace is so obvious sometimes. Often we overlook it. I never would have thought, you know, years later, looking back, that, you know, this is God putting these men in my life and this family in my life for a reason. I had a pretty normal childhood. Liked being outdoors. I grew up in the friendship community over in Bent Tree. Some of you may know that area. I remember they came through and did something in our neighborhood that they don't do a lot nowadays, and they freshly paved the roads. So I remember being a kid, riding a bike down those freshly paved roads, and man, we thought we were kings because we had our own private paved roads, and it was just, man, we had a great childhood. We'd stay out till dark until Dad or Mom would yell, it's time to come home. Or a lot of times we'd hear our neighbor whistle because he had one of them loud whistles I ain't never been able to do. I want to try. And we'd come home, and then I'd go inside, and I'd always tinker with, you know, audio, video, technology, computers, anything electrical, tech, really. And at the time, I just thought it was what I enjoyed. It was fun. It's what I love to do. Little did I know that God would turn it into a ministry later on, and it was God preparing me for what I was meant to do. So growing up, I always had that fascination for tech, and I always understood computers and electrical components more than most people. Well, after I was saved at youth camp when I was a teenager, that fascination grew into a desire to use my hobbies, my gifts for the church. I credit this to seeing my dad run sound at church, my mom, my grandfather, and other people serve in the church and sing. I didn't really realize at the time that it was a calling to ministry or a way to reach people for Jesus. I just saw it as a way to serve the church and play with cool stuff that I could probably never afford. God would change that outlook later, though. So when I was a young teenager, I was in church, had been most of my life. Probably most of you can say that. You grew up in church with your family. I read my Bible. I went to youth gatherings. I did the Baptist Sway twice on Sundays and once on Wednesday. I prayed, and I just had, I had a relationship with God. And that's what he asked us to do. He asked us to have a relationship. So the first way that we can be sure that we're not wasting God's grace is to seek him first and often. And that's my first point. God is not a drive-through God. He wants us to call on him, make a reservation, sit down and feast on his word and his wisdom. We can't just listen to his radio sermon once a week and expect to be fed. We have to actively seek him and seek his word. Make time for him, not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's not convenient. And see, that's where I went wrong. As I grew into a young man, I did as lots of people do. I didn't spend as much time with God. I decided I would rather go out and hang out with friends, party, experiment with drugs and alcohol. Pretty soon, instead of going to church, it was, oh, I have to go to church. I didn't desire to be in his presence anymore because I let other things become my God. And by the time I got to my 20s, I was a high school dropout, and all I had on my mind was drinking, partying, drugs. You name an illegal substance, I've probably ingested it. Not a very good environment to plan for the future or to find a godly woman. We have a saying in our house that we use a lot. It's called "but God." Because anything you do, but God has other plans. See, Andrea, my wife, God's timing is perfect. See, before I started to pull away from him and He allowed me to meet the most wonderful person on this earth. My wife, Andrea, and I met right here at this school during band camp in 1997. And I believe if we hadn't met before all those, what I call the stupid years, she and her family never would have known the real me and never would have held on as long as she did. See, Andrea is the definition of a virtuous woman that the Bible speaks of. She knew through all the drugs and abuse and adultery before we were married that it wasn't me. It wasn't what God had intended for us. Andrea stood by my side through so much, and the only way I can explain it is the grace of God. In 2004, we were married, and our oldest daughter, Allie, was born. My life was forever changed. She's like a piece of me. She's just like me. Crazy. And I'm a family man now, and it's time to grow up and stop living the selfish life I've been living. Unfortunately, the whole drugs sometimes puts on you is strong. And you're convinced that you can balance life, a normal life of normalcy and the addiction. My daughter Allie has seen things and heard things that my youngest daughter Anderson will never be able to comprehend. My daughter's had 2 different dads growing up. Luckily, they're still growing up a little bit, and God was good enough to change things. But Allie will know those things and those sides of me that many people's never seen. At this point, me and Andrea and Allie, we had moved into a house over in Corinth area, Seneca. I was working at S&S and still a slave to the pain pills. I remember it got to where I would take so many each day that I couldn't hold my head up or I couldn't hold my eyes open. I would get the pain in my side and in my gut, and I realized at that moment that I was killing myself. The drugs were killing me. At that point, God began to work on me and help me realize what I was doing to my family. I fought him, and the drugs were still a very powerful hold in my life. I lost my job, which in turn put a hurt on buying more drugs and to support my habit. It wasn't long before we hit rock bottom, and enough was enough. Andrea made it clear that it was time to get clean or she and Allie would be gone. I entered to a program at this clinic in Anderson. You probably know the kind of clinic I'm talking about. Sometimes these clinics are just as bad as doing the drugs themselves. But if you're serious enough, you can come out the end clean and sober. Which after a good while, that's what I did. It wasn't easy. At the time, I got a job working landscaping with my cousin. And a lot of mornings, we were making the trip to Anderson Clinic, 3 and 4 a.m., because that's the only time they're open. They didn't trust you enough to give you more than a dose, for that day. Imagine that, somebody not trusting the drug addict. But I began to piece my life back together. I eventually quit going to the clinic and detoxed from the meds, and I was clean for the first time in a long time. I started a new job at Doak Power, was honestly living what I thought was my best life and our best life. We continued to party, and after a few years at Duke, I had moved into a lead role, and at the time, I blamed it on the stress of the job and family, but I started taking the pills again. For a while, it was very mild, 1 or 2 here and there, not every day. But it wasn't long, and it was back to an everyday habit. I would go out all hours of the night and leave my pregnant wife, who's pregnant with our youngest daughter, Anderson, home to worry where I was and if I would come back alive. After Anderson was born, I remember my favorite thing to do was get up on Saturday morning while Andrea and Allie were still asleep and sit with Anderson in our recliner and just stare at her and just love on her. But I remember that I couldn't even do that without first going out to my truck that was in the garage and sneaking a few pills just so I could feel normal. And I realized I should be able to enjoy this moment with my child, with my kids, my family, without having to pop those pills just to renew me for the day. I wasn't being the father and the husband I should. I was squandering all these things God had given me. Andrea had her suspicions for that I was on the pills again, and I had been denying it. But I finally came clean with her, and I'll never forget her words. She was mad, but with disappointment and love in her voice, she said, "This is the last time. I'll help you get clean, but this happens again, me and the girls are gone." And I believed her. We had a vacation plan in a couple weeks coming up, so I took some extra days off and detoxed over the next few days and recouped over vacation. I remember detoxing and sleeping for days. I remember the dreams. Felt like I was being visited by the ghosts you see in like the Ghost of Christmas Past and the Ghost of Christmas Future, but it was showing me versions of my life if I didn't stick to what I was doing, what I had promised I would do. It was at one point I woke up and felt the sensation of clarity. The reason I hadn't been successful in cleaning myself up before, the reason I went back to the pills, the reason I went back to the alcohol and the partying and the staying out all night is because I couldn't do it alone. Only God could. So I fell on my knees beside my bed, and I said, "God, I'm done. I'm done living for me. From now on, I'll follow your lead in every aspect of my life. Wherever you say go, I'll go. Whatever you say do, I'll do. My life is yours. I just want to serve you." And let me tell you, be careful if you get on your knees and you say that and you mean it, because he will. He'll use you. So our second way that we're not to waste God's grace is to surrender to his will. Cautiously surrender to his will. See, once you surrender and tell God that you're ready, you had better be ready. He already knows the day when you'll surrender. So he'll situate you in a certain way and place and people in your life so that when it's time, everything comes together to bring him glory. Pastor Sandra, as most of you know, is my wife's cousin. Well, she's been more important in our life than I think she probably knows. See, that house we lived in Corinth, she was our neighbor. And it was through her that I got my job at Duke, which I call my career today. And even after we moved away to the other side of town, she continued to be inspiration in our life and influence. When Anderson was born, I remember her and Joel coming to visit us in the hospital. And I'll never forget the day when she called Andrea and said the words that changed our lives. Joel and I and a group of crazy people are launching a church. And I swear my heart stopped. I remember I was sitting in the recliner of our living room, and Andrea she was on the phone, and she kind of put the phone, she said, they're starting a church. They want us to know if we'll come. And my heart literally stopped. It was like I'd see God across the room, a crowded room. And you know when you see your buddies and you're about to do something crazy that's like fail vlog worthy, and they go, that's what it felt like. God said, this is you. You're up. And not even knowing exactly what I wanted to do, I knew it was something technical, because that's what God has always given me the gifts for, is to all the technical stuff. And I told Dre, I said, tell them I'll run sound. So 2 months earlier, I had surrendered to God. But little did I know, he already had the plans and the people in place. I knew exactly where I was to serve. He already had a plan for our life as a family. He had already been leading up to this. Everything he had done up to this moment was to bring him glory. It wasn't so I could stand up here and say that I've come through all this, or we've come through all this, but that God brought us through all this. And if he brought us through it, and I've hit a high level. There's a lot of details that I don't know if I'd ever share with anybody. That's just it was a dark time for us. But it was nothing we did to come out the other end. It was all God. It was his plan. In September 2012, one launched the church. And again, I was actively seeking him. I was surrendering to his will for the first time in my life. I wasn't wasting the grace God had showed me. And band, you guys can come on up and start playing if you want. I'm almost done. God began to bless our family. Our marriage was better than it had ever been. I felt like I was being the father I was supposed to be. I was promoted at my job. We just began to really feel like we were exactly where we should be. And I say all that not to brag, but to give God all the glory. Because once you seek him, once you surrender to his will, he will start lining things up in your life. Is it always going to be easy? No. We've come across some of the hardest times after surrendering and serving him that we've ever had. Some of the hardest times. But there's a difference when you're putting your faith in the substances of life, or you put your faith in God. When you go through those troubles, it's like night and day, because you know if your faith's in God, you're going to come out the other end okay. There's worry. Everybody worries. It's our human nature. But you know that God's got you. And it's just different. So different. Which brings me to my last point. The last way we can be sure we're not wasting his grace is to avoid self-glorification. I want to go back to our Bible verse as I close up here. And you guys can stand. I want to go back to 1 Corinthians 15. I want to back up a little bit and go to verse 9. So this is after the resurrection, and Jesus appeared to many people, but Paul was the last he appeared to after his ascension. And Paul says, it was fitting that I bring up the rear. I don't deserve to be included in that inner circle. As you well know, having spent all those early years trying best to stomp out God's church right out of existence. See, as a zealous Pharisee, Paul had been the enemy of the Christian church, even to the point of capturing and persecuting Christian believers. So he felt unworthy to be called as an apostle of Christ, as many of us do. We feel unworthy. Even though he was probably the most influential of the apostles, Paul was deeply humble. He knew that he had worked hard and accomplished much, but only because God had poured kindness and grace upon him. See, true humility is not convincing yourself that you're worthless, but recognizing God's work in you. It's having God's perspective on who you are and acknowledging His grace in developing your abilities. As we go on in Corinthians there, our verses that we started with today, but because God was so gracious, so very generous, here I am. And I'm not about to let His grace go to waste. Haven't I worked hard trying to do more than any of the others? Even then, my work didn't amount to that much. It was God giving me the work to do. God giving me the energy to do it. Paul wrote of working harder than the other apostles. This wasn't an arrogant boast, because he knew that his power came from God, and it really didn't matter who worked the hardest. God, we thank you today for allowing us to gather in your name. We thank you for your grace. God, I just thank you for this opportunity to get up and divide your word. God, I ask that there's anyone here today that doesn't know you, that they'll know you before we leave this place today, God. With every head bowed and every eye closed. If you feel like today is the day to make that decision for Jesus, for God, devote your life to Him. It's not hard. It's a simple prayer. Just repeat these words. Jesus, save me. I turn from the way I'm living, and I embrace your way in my life.
Hey, thanks so much for being here with us today. Make sure to stay connected with us throughout the week online at onechurchsc.org and on social media at onechurchsc. We believe God has something unique to say to you, and our hope is that you feel His love stronger today than ever before. Thanks again for being here with us, and have a great week.